I'm Jonathan Horn.
I'm Cody Atkinson.
And I'm Matteo Schlapek-Sevillo. And this is the 110 Percenters podcast. On this week's show, we chat Scott Pendlebury breaking the all-time VFL AFL games record, what Stephen King has done to revitalise Melbourne, and anything else that we deem interesting enough to talk about. My name is Matteo Schlapek-Sevillo. As I've already explained, listeners, you might know me as the author of the One Percenters newsletter. I'm joined by Cody and Jonathan. Cody, how are you today?
Yeah, not too bad. How are you going, Matteo?
Really, really well. And Jonathan, how are you, mate?
I'm good. Good to be here, guys.
Yeah, isn't it fabulous? We had a little bit of a dry run last week, but we are, of course, I guess, trying to make a new impression on the footy media landscape, the footy podcast landscape. So let's see how we
We're the
go.
first, yeah.
We are the first footy podcast. That's why I think we should go with the footy podcast as our tagline.
I'm glad that someone finally thought of it. There's so many podcasts about so many things, but Australian football not having a podcast until now, a bit mind-blowing.
It's shocking that this gap in the market has persisted for so long, and I'm so glad that the three of us were, entrepreneurial enough and clever enough to have found it and hopefully drive through it. Look, maybe on a more serious note, perhaps it's worth just chatting for a few seconds about why the three of us have come together and decided to start this, and I suppose what kind of voice we hope to add to the footy media landscape. For my part, I suppose people might know I've been doing the One Percenters newsletter for a couple of years now, and a lot of that was motivated by I think not having enough of the kind of footy writing that I wanted to read, and eventually getting a little bit exasperated and deciding, well, okay, maybe I'll write it. In that case, given I spend so much of my life watching footy and thinking about footy. But Cody and Jonathan, you've both been on the scene for longer than me in terms of writing, in terms of having that public profile. So please, really interested to hear from you both about why you've decided to join me in this project.
Yeah, I think it's just great to be on with you both. I think I've told you this off air before, but not to our esteemed listeners. But I've enjoyed the work of both of you two for a long time now. I think there's still room for long form writing in sport and elsewhere, and I think you guys do it really well. And I think also that I think we all come at this sport from a different place, and I think that we all have our certain focus areas and our certain skill sets, but we have this shared love for the sport, which I think comes through in our writing. And I think it's a good idea to bring us together in more of a verbal podcasting form.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'm pretty much from the same angle. I'm just here to have a good conversation. Like, I live in Canberra. I like to hear diverse views. And I think as our audience grows, I kind of want to hear from all of you listeners and hear your questions over time so we can discuss them. I think there just needs to be a good conversation about the game on field and off field. And so we can deepen our understanding and enjoy each weekend a little bit more than we did before.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth saying that the three of us have all been really lucky to have sort of cultivated, really attentive and engaged and intelligent audiences. I'm sort of constantly really interested in the feedback and comments that I get on the pieces I write, and I find that the stuff that you guys write so insightful and intelligent, and so I don't know, the idea of cultivating a little community like that around a podcast is something that excites me. I think that probably marks a reasonably good segue then to talk about a subject which, of course, has generated very sensible discourse, very, very reasoned chat this week. And that, of course, is Scott Pendlebury, the Collingwood legend. He will play game number 433 this Saturday afternoon, Saturday twilight at the MCE. The best time slot in footy, by the way, against West Coast. He'll bring up 433, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to try and put his accomplishment into a bit of historical context. We're going to talk about his place in the Collingwood Pantheon, and we're going to talk about whether we think his record will stand the test of time. So, Cody, maybe the place to start is you have done some digging, into the numbers about, I guess, how exceptional Pendlebury's achievement is.
Yeah, thank you, Matteo. It's pretty remarkable. Up until very recently in football history, we never had a 400 game player, KB, hit the 400 club, and we've had a few more since then. And we might touch on the other members. For a lot of footy's history, there was 14 and 18 game seasons. Scott Pendlebury averages more than 20 games a year for the last 21 years odd. So it's quite remarkable. It's really when we started playing professional-ish football in 1897-ish, playing 400 games would have been seen as impossible. And to have a guy who's about to hit 433, it's just sheerly remarkable. Jonathan, what's your take on it?
I think for me, it's exactly what you were saying there, but it's like we hear so much with Pendlebury about time and space. I think everything I've ever read or written, or everything I've read or heard about Scott Pendlebury mentions time or space. And I think the key to his career and the key to his longevity, and also the key to all of those other 400 gamers who gathered at the MCG, they all have certain things in common. And with him, it's temperament. It takes a certain temperament, I think, to be able to last that long. And he just about has the perfect sporting temperament to ensure longevity. And that is someone who doesn't get too phased when things go wrong and doesn't get ahead of him when things go badly. And that includes grand final losses and things like that, which, may I add, makes this week's festivities and the lead into it a little bit all the stranger, because a lot of that, to me, and I don't know what you got, I'd be interested to see what you both think of this, but it doesn't really marry up with the personality that he is. And I guess maybe that sort of says something about how well he's equipped to get through a week like this, because he can sort of just shrug his shoulders and go through. But I'd be interested in what you guys think of that.
Yeah, I find the juxtaposition really fascinating because Collingwood are obviously a club that stirs lots of passions, negative and positive, highly polarising, I suppose, a political scientist or an academic might say. But Pendlebury himself, I think you touched on that temperament, Jonathan. I think that is one of the real ingredients that's helped him to get to 433. And obviously people, especially maybe those who aren't as invested in the accomplishment, they'll point to the fact that he has played 273 of his 432 games at the MCG. So there is the travel element, there's the sports science element, there's the fact that, of course, Collingwood have been such a consistent team that's been contending for so often, so he does play those extra handful of games in so many of those seasons. And then there is the fact that his playing style is so... it's so composed, yes, and that time and space element, but it's so unkinetic in a way. It's so careful. He's managed his body beautifully off the field in terms of his preparation, professionalism, but also just on the field. He I mean, of course, he wraps other players up, he tackles, he gets tackled, but he's not in so many of these big, high-energy collisions that you see so many players participate in.
I was just going to say...
Sorry, Cody, you go.
No, you go, Jonathan.
And that's something, like I mentioned before, about him having in common with the other 400 gamers, is that ability that none of those sort of shirked issues, none of those players were soft, none of those players were, a lot of them played in very violent eras, but they had an ability to avoid grievous bodily harm, which is a real skill, and it's something that he has, to be in the thick of the action but to not put himself in harm's way. And that is a key ingredient to being able to last that long. As he said, also the way he looks after his body, I think on preliminary final day last year was the first time he'd ever had a soft tissue injury. Now that says a lot about how anyone over the age of 30 who's ever gone for a run at night knows that calf muscles are the first things that go, and that happens to elite athletes as well. And the fact that he avoided that for so long says so much about how he prepares and just how he lives his life off the field.
There's a somewhat insane Collingwood video that goes into the life of him off season and preparing on season. There's another one, and he's got like a bath that he keeps, like an ice bath type thing that he gets in like 8 times a day or something like that. His preparation is genuinely insane. Dane Swan, I think... Oh, you go, Jonathan.
No, I wasn't interrupting then. Sorry, I was going to go after you. But it's an example of just how, it's not particularly interesting reading about a guy doing 8 saunas a day or 8 bath plunge pulls a day or whatever it is that he's doing. Doesn't really make for the most riveting reading, but that's how that's how you get to play 433 games. And if you were talking to a 17 or 18-year-old, if they had that kind of temperament, who can almost endure that kind of, for want of a better word, boredom of the routine, of the grind, that's how you got to do it.
I came across a couple of really interesting interviews during the week too. Like there was an interview with his junior footy coach out in Sale, and he's like, Scott had the keys to the gym for basketball, and he'd put up hundreds of shots a day, and that's for the sport he didn't choose. I mean, Dane Swan talked about him being constantly the hardest worker at Collingwood and him evolving and changing his game. McRae tried to play him in defence a few years ago, and everyone just forgets that because he slotted back into the midfield and started dominating again. His brilliance isn't his own output, while it's incredible, and we'll touch on that a bit later. It's how he enabled the team. A lot of his work, he leads the league since 2012 in defence half pressure acts, which is about as unsexy a stat as you can get. For a guy that we acknowledge as a offensive weapon, he leads the league in tackles all time. He leads the lead in defensive half pressure acts. He works to make others better. And it's a bit like the iceberg. We only see the inside 50s or the goals. We ignore all the other little things, his anticipation to get into the right spot where the ball's going to be or where the opponent's going to escape from. And that, for me, is the brilliance of Scott Pendlebury. I think he's probably a little under-acknowledged for that reason, because remember the Dangerfields bursting from the pack or the Martins one out in the goal square, Petrarca kicking, 4 goals from centre bounce in the 2021 grand final. He doesn't have that defining moment, but, I mean, he has 2 premierships. He's got 6 All-Australians.
And he bounced the ball on a pigeon once. I mean, that's a defining moment. I hope you're not.
Shane Mumford sold him a dunny.
Yeah. well, yeah. Perhaps we won't have too many Collingwood listeners going forward based on that. I think you raise a great point. Pendlebury isn't a highlights player by definition, but that is not to diminish the player that he has been. I can't think of a more excellent or accomplished lieutenant on field. This is someone who debuted alongside Nathan Buckley the day that Nathan Buckley got 25 and 6. I think kicked 6 goals the day Pendlebury debuted, and now obviously for the last 4 or 5 years, Pendlebury has mentored players like Nick Dacos at Collingwood, and then obviously there's been a decade in between. The ability to be almost a player coach, a kind of brain on the field, to me it's completely inseparable from this impression that people are so often left with when they watch Collingwood play, especially under Craig McRae, that they are so well coached, so well drilled. Well, which player do you think has a big impact on making sure that those specific tactical instructions about how to hold space, when to release runners, how to kind of, patch up problems mid-game? Pendlebury is the one driving so much of that. So it is hugely underappreciated. The fact that he doesn't, of course, have as many of those individual accomplishments as so many of the, the greatest midfielders and the greatest players of the 21st century. But I think in terms of significance to a club, it's hard to think of too many who have made a bigger impression, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When I think of, and when you say, when we get these, almost polls that say who's the greatest player, so, of the last 25 years or anything like that, they can be interpreted in so many different ways. I mean, who's the most valuable player? Who's the most beloved player? Who means more to a particular club? I look at what Joel Selwood means to Geelong supporters compared to, say, a Gary Ablett Jr. So they're 2 very different things. And I think with Pendlebury, a lot of what we're seeing this week is to do with that connection with his fans and the fact that Collingwood, he's spanned so many years and so many different footy's evolved so much in that time. We've seen so many different iterations of the game, and the body shapes have changed and the coaching has changed, but he hasn't really changed at all. Cody mentioned that he was sort of sent to half back for a while, but that didn't really last too long. So he's kind of just maintained this even keel all the way through, while there's been all this chaos around him and all this change around him, and he's just maintained this steady, always excellent output. And I think that's why I admire him so much.
Look, it's worth touching on, I suppose, the circus, perhaps, or that all that discourse that has been going on in the last couple of weeks. There's obviously the fact that he has been managed in the run up to the record breaking game. He obviously didn't play at the SCG in the Marngrook game. Some wags pointing out that maybe Pendlebury's steady kind of calmness would have been good in a close game like that, and so instead he'll obviously have the chance to break the record in front of his adoring Collingwood fans. There's the gold number on the Guernsey. Something that I know and really admire about the two of you is neither of you are hot take merchants exactly. Clearly, this has been something that a lot of people have had emotions about online. Over the last couple of weeks. I don't know if there are any strong takes that you want to put out about I guess maybe the media circus that's followed this game.
Look, I'm old school mind. I think it's a shame that they're not wearing lace-up jerseys anymore and knickerbockers. Like studs on boots. You go back to 1910, there was a revolution that they're going to put rubbers on the soles for better grips. They used to wear work shoes back then. Like, I think all of this is a shame. They're not wearing wool anymore, guys. They're not wearing wool.
So, Cody, clearly what you're saying is that the best way to acknowledge Pendlebury's record would have been to get him in the Guernsey and the boots and the gear where it was around when he debuted.
Yeah. Alongside Methuselah and Moses, yeah. I think at the end of the day, footy changes, right? And there's a lot of things that we wish we had in the past of what was great about footy, You'd go to the game, not get blasted in the ears for 2 hours, and you'd just watch a bit of a scrap, right? But there's also elements like Menzies had a car seat, so he didn't have to get out of his car to watch Carlton games. There's things like that would have kept fans and punters out. And I think the whole thing is making it more accessible for fans. And if a gold number helps like a kid watching their first couple of games acknowledge who Pendlebury is, so when they're 80, they can remember that they saw Pendlebury run around on the G for his 433rd. Look, that's okay. There is an unfortunate commerciality element, and maybe it made them worse for a couple of weeks. But if that stops them from making the top 10 now, that's because they're not a good team, not because of a kick in a close game. Ultimately, they're not going to win a flag for that one result, in my view. But Jonathan, you might have a different take.
Yeah, possibly. I guess I don't have the strong sort of hot take on this. I sit somewhere in the middle, but it's more that the actual feat itself doesn't really lend itself to mass overkill, if that makes sense. Like, it's not as if he's breaking the goal kicking record, which is more of a very extroverted moment, so to speak. This is all of those 400 gamers who gathered are all of a very similar personality. They're very low-key people, some more than others. I mean, not everyone's as low-key as Michael Tuck or Dustin Fletcher, but it does sort of sit a little funnily with Pendlebury's personality and the way that he has carried himself and the way that he prepares for games, to suddenly have this player walking around in a gold-plated number who's doing 10 costume changes during a game, who's clearly going to make a lot of money out of this. He's going to give a lot of it to charity, presumably. But, there is something of that sits a little bit uneasily. And there's something also of the...
Do you reckon he's a bit uncomfortable with the whole spectacle?
I'm not so sure. He's such an even temperament. I think he can sort of handle either scenario. But it is very differently to compare this to, say, the way North Melbourne handled Brent Harvey breaking the record. Two very, very different players and two very, very different clubs, and two very, very different occasions. So, look, I think it may have been handled a little bit differently if Collingwood saw themselves as a premiership contender this year, which they clearly don't. I think that would have shifted their thinking a little bit. But to be honest, as a neutral, if Scott Pendlebury's playing his record game at the MCG rather than the SCG in Teeming Rain, that doesn't really bother me too much.
I think we should move on in a little bit to talk about some of the other 400 gamers and our memories of them. But maybe before we do that, let's talk about perhaps let's say each of us contribute a memory that we have of Scott Pendlebury. It might have been a particular moment in a game, or just, I suppose, one impression that we're left with, over a journey that's now gone for 20 years.
Oh, look, I'm such a serious person when I'm writing and such an unserious person in real life. And because the two that come to mind are the dreadlocks and Mumford's Dummy.
I was
Mumford's
going to
Dummy
mention the
was,
dreadlocks.
yeah, like that's a generational moment for that club. But like, he was phenomenal in a couple of grand finals. Like, Pendlebury, I guess it's just looking at a physical monument. You know, you see Uluru, Uluru's always there. Scott Pendlebury's always in there doing things for Collingwood. It's Jonathan talked about it. He's not a highlights guy. And the highlights we have are maybe negative because we always expect him to do the right thing. So it's more remarkable when he doesn't do the right thing. And that's special, right? Oh no, Jonathan, do you have a clear memory of Pendles?
Oh, I've got so many. I actually I remember in I've got a vivid memory of the 2011 grand final, which they lost, and he just played so well that day for Collingwood. And it's not a game that's sort of gone down in the memory bank for a lot of Collingwood people, but he was best on ground in that game. I reckon to 3/4 time. And I remember thinking he was on his way to his second Norm Smith medal in as many years. But also, and I cannot remember, I don't think it was an Anzac Day game, but it was a game against Essendon. I think it was the one where Jamie Elliott kicked that goal after the siren in the forward pocket there at the Punt Road end. And it was basically Essendon. It was just a fiasco from Essendon's point of view. And it was just perfectly orchestrated by Pendlebury. And I think he did an interview the next day on one of the radio stations or maybe even in one of the newspapers where he explained his thinking about that passage of play. It took about 13 seconds and it caught Essendon off guard and they moved the ball from one end of the ground to the other. And it was all Pendlebury staying in the moment, thinking his way through it. And he essentially, I'm not even sure he touched the ball in that passage of play, but he was the brains behind that. And I think that just sums up his career. Matteo, what about you?
My memory is quite different. So it's been pointed out that Pendlebury debuted before Channel 7 actually regained the broadcast rights. And so I have a distinct memory of, I suppose it must have been 2006 or 2007. And it would have been probably a Sunday afternoon game that Pendlebury was playing. And Eddie Maguire was on the call. This is, of course, Eddie Maguire used to call a lot of Collingwood games. And clearly he was...
Are you saying he was everywhere?
Yeah, Eddie everywhere, that's right. He was obviously keen to talk up lots of young Collingwood players, and I remember him talking up guys like Yakabuchi and Sean Rusling, and all these players who never amounted to much. But I do remember the enthusiasm and the excitement with which he spoke about a young Pendlebury, and that was the way that I guess 15 or 16-year-old me learnt that Scott Pendlebury had a basketball background, which is something that I've heard just once or twice in the intervening couple of decades. But yeah, so my Pendlebury memories is kind of funny actually. It was a 19-year-old Pendlebury being talked up as one to watch by Eddie Maguire, and look, you can't dispute Eddie was absolutely on the money. Maybe just a very quick segue because I think it's a question worth asking for the two of you guys. Where is Pendlebury in the pantheon of Collingwood's best ever players? Maybe we'll start with you, Jonathan.
I think it's funny because Michael Roberts and Glenn McFarlane wrote a book ranking Collingwood's best ever players, and that was back in 2017, and Pendlebury was ranked 10th on that list. And it's something that Shannon Gill and Gerard Whateley spoke about on their Know Your History segment on SEN, which is just so great. I love listening to that. Now, there's been 9 years since then. He's played just under 200 games since then. He's come runner-up in the Copeland 3 times. He's won a flag and he lost another one by 2 or 3 points. I think given that he had been ranked 10, he'd won 5 Copeland trophies to that point. I think the ensuing 9 years, I think it's a no-brainer that he has... it's interesting reading that book that Jock McHale nominated on his deathbed. He nominated Bobby Rose as the best Collingwood player he'd ever seen, and Bobby Rose on his deathbed nominated Buckley as the best he's ever seen. And I think that we're unequivocally at the point where Pendlebury has taken that mantle at Collingwood.
I'll take a slightly different tack, Jonathan, and I haven't read that book yet, but I'm kind of interested. I think in these best ever discussions, we always get hit with this: who's physically the best ever, or maybe the greatest versus the best is a bit of a nuanced discussion. I think Pendlebury is probably, the most talented player to ever play for Collingwood. I would probably say he's better than Daicos in my view, which might be a bit controversial. I don't think Daicos will hit as good as what Pendlebury is for those reasons that we've discussed earlier. I think we're forgetting guys like Coventry had the goals record for such a long time.
I knew you were going to mention Coventry. I knew you were going to mention Coventry. I love it.
Well, both Coventries. I mean, Coventry had the goal. Gordon Coventry had the goals record, but many said Sid was the better player at the time.
And Michael Roberts and Glenn McFarlane had Sid at number 3. So I think they had Gordon at 7 or 8 on that list. So yeah, they've had so many great players, but they've never had that one like obvious legendary player. They didn't have a player in the team of the century in 1996, which they still haven't gotten over. But yeah, I'm keen to Gordon Coventry. You could talk me into that, Cody.
Well, I'll throw you a couple more names. Gordon Coventry, of course, practiced barefoot, would have played barefoot had he have had his wish and rarely ventured from the goal square. So look, I'll give you that one, but I'll throw a couple more names. Jock McHale was actually a very, very good player, and his coaching career probably does disservice to his playing career on all the written records. I've been doing a lot of research into coaching lately, and he got the gig mostly because he was a great player, not because he was a great leader. He became a good leader. But he said 12 years into his coaching career that everything he did at Collingwood was based on the work of one man, the greatest Collingwood player that he played with to that day, Dick Condon. Condon didn't play for Collingwood for a long time, but you can tie Collingwood's success during that early era to Condon. And Condon, Angus took over from Condon, and McHale was Angus's assistant coach and all that. I think I'm not going to nominate a best ever because I'm a fence sitter. I love sitting on fences. What I'm going to say is in these discussions and rushes to pick a definitive number one, I think we always look for the guy who's in front of us. Pendlebury might be the greatest player. I didn't watch Dick Condon. I didn't watch Jock McHale. I mean, I didn't even watch Lou. Fun?
I hope you didn't, Cody.
I was going to say, did you watch him?
I'm old, but I'm not that old. I remember. I remember. I remember Peter Daicos certainly, and he gets brought up in these discussions as well in terms of the sheer enjoyment a player can bring to a fan base as well. His name from rusted on Collingwood supporters because he was robbed of a lot of good years through injury, and there's a lot of sort of learned people who should probably know better, who still insist that Peter Daicos was a better player than Pendlebury, which is interesting.
Okay, can I give you one more anecdote? And we'll probably cut this for length, but if this is in there, congratulations, listeners, for making
Cody,
it
you're doing the edit. I mean, there's a little peek behind the veil, so you have to choose what stays in.
So my grandparents migrated from a German POW camp post-World War II. They lived, as farmers in rural Victoria. I lived next door to them. So my grandparents babysit for me a fair bit while my mum was at uni to try to better herself. And my granddad had a very failing grip of English, but he was a mad and a hardcore Collingwood fan because when he migrated to the country, he got told that you have to be with Collingwood or against Collingwood. And one of the few English language things that he had was highlights of the 1990 grand final on VHS, the season on VHS. So when he got fed up with talking to me in Yugoslav or Serbian, and I couldn't speak it and I still can't, and the communication barrier was too much. I was footy mad as a 4, 5, 6-year-old. He'd just put the VHS on and I'd be spellbound for an hour or two. So Daicos is one of those guys. Mullane, there's a lot of those classic era Collingwood guys where Lee Matthews helped them break that drought. Shaw, a lot of people have Shaw as the heart and soul of that club for a while. I think greatest depends on, or the best depends on your frame of view and your lens. There's a very long time in my life that Peter Daicos would have been the greatest Collingwood player for that reason, and certainly for my granddad, I think he was too.
Well, of course, the discussion about where exactly Pendlebury figures in Collingwood's pantheon is an interesting one, but I think it's safe to say that he ranks very, very prominently. He has been a great player. Congratulations to him. Hopefully we've done him a little bit of justice. Listeners, we are going to catch our breath for a little bit, and then I think we're going to do a little sidebar. We're going to do a little bit more reminiscing, a little bit more remembering some guys, and maybe talk about the other members of the 400 Club and their impacts on the game, their contributions, and our memories of them.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters podcast.
Welcome back to the 110 Percenters podcast with Cody Atkinson, Jonathan Horn, and me, Matteo Schlapek-Sevilla. We have hopefully done Scott Pendlebury some justice. 1 minute for each of his 432 games. And we're going to move on now to talk a little bit about the other members of the 400 Club, because, of course, Pendlebury this Saturday is going to overtake the incumbent or the co-record holder, Brent Harvey. Of course, much to the chagrin of many North Melbourne fans who thought that he had a few more games in him. But the other members of that extremely prestigious club are Dustin Fletcher, Kevin Bartlett, Sean Burgoyne, and, of course, Michael Tuck. So guys, look, I mean, it's astonishing, really. It is an incredible achievement. There have been thousands and thousands of men and women who've played our game professionally, and there are 6 who've played 400 at the highest level. So no matter which way you slice it, these are great players, but they're quite different players. I think something that I'm immediately struck by is the fact that, of course, 4 of the 6 members of the 400 Club have played, well, a large degree, a large chunk, I would say, of their footy in the 21st century. And that does not strike me as coincidence. There's obviously the fact that seasons are getting longer. The AFL, I guess, manufactures a reason to add a round in every couple of years, it feels like. But this also feels like a story of the evolution and the progress of sports science, dietary management, professionalism as well, which makes me think that Pendlebury will get to whatever number he gets to, and it may end up over 450. I really wouldn't be surprised. He's been talking the last few days about maybe playing on next year. But I don't know. Maybe there'll be a 500 gamer in not too long a time. So I don't know if there are reminiscences or thoughts that you guys have to share about other members of that 400 club, or I guess the historical context of the achievement. Jonathan?
I'm going to show my age here with a couple of spring chickens I'm talking to here, but I am old enough to remember KB playing his 400th. And that was a big, big deal. It was in 1983, and by that point, Richmond were on a spiral that would last, for years and years. But that was such a big thing. And maybe it's just because I was a kid, but I'm sure there's more to it than this, is that the banner that he ran through, it was like something that had been constructed in outer space. It was the most astonishing thing I think I'd ever seen. I was 5 years old at the time. So I never really properly got an appreciation of KB, but I certainly saw Tucky play a lot of footy. And Tucky, even in the mid-'80s, was being pensioned off. People were saying he's too old, he's over the hill, all this. And that would have been in like 84, 85 when Hawthorn were losing those grand finals to Essendon. And he kept going. And to the point where he ended up captaining 2 of his last 3 years. He captained the flag, and he was reluctant to go as well. He was sort of, Hawthorn had run out of money by that point, and he didn't want to leave. He wanted to keep playing. So one thing that they do have in common is that I think Harvey's the outlier physically to them. Harvey was more of a little bit more of a ballistic player, whereas the others were long and lean and conserve their energy a lot, whereas Harvey was a little bit different to that. But the others, one thing that they did have is they were all clean living. Like these weren't party boys. These weren't guys who were going out on the piss like Wayne Carey or Dermy or someone like that, and who were probably, I feel
like we need to go allegedly like everywhere here, Jonathan.
Of course. Well, with the Duck, I should give Wayne the benefit of the doubt with all things concerning this, of course. But they were all they led pretty clean lives and they looked after themselves. Even KB, back in the early 80s, really looked after his body and did the extra work and things like that, which was unusual back then. So that KB's 400th
was a triple 400th, yeah? I just remember reading something. It was his 400th game, 400th handball, and 400th hair on his head left, like all in the same week. No, sorry.
If he slid 400, surely he was doing 400 hairs. That is, surely he would have been doing all right. I was actually going to ask you a question, Jonathan. A slightly cheeky one. If you remember what state KB's hair was in on his 400th game, but maybe that would be a little bit disrespectful. Yeah, the physical profile of the players. I'm really glad you mentioned that because this just stands out to me so well. And obviously being a little bit younger, not that young as anymore myself, but I have a distinct memory, of course, of Pendlebury. My kind of football watching life has encompassed his entire career. That was also true of Sean Burgoyne. I remember him playing for Port Adelaide, of course, a lazy 150 or so games before he moved over to Victoria to play for Hawthorn. And Fletcher and Harvey, and they're all, I don't know, such different types. I suppose there is similarity there, isn't there, between Burgoyne and Pendlebury, that energy conservation, right? This ability to kind of have maximum impact, maximum efficiency, and to let their sort of brain do so much of the work, I guess, particularly later in their career to extend their career. But Fletcher, of course, he played in, I suppose what a lot of us probably think is maybe a more contested era in the sense that, defenders like him, and he was obviously very spindly and very lean for most of his career, were getting beat up a lot. Big forwards were sort of leaving one in. There was no reluctance to sort of, leave an elbow in or something like that. So, of course, that is a remarkable achievement, even if maybe he wasn't quite at the peak of his powers by game 400. But obviously, Brent Harvey's accomplishment, particularly with that, ballistic profile as well, and maybe younger listeners, hopefully there are many, might not perhaps remember the player Brent Harvey, but as that sort of outside leaning, yes, but that kind of half forward winger type. I'd really be fascinated to see how a player like Harvey, with his speed and his power, would actually fare in today's AFL, because people talk about that kind of high half forward archetype, and Harvey feels almost like a bit of a blueprint of that in some sense. I'd really be interested to see him play footy in the 2020s.
And
he's
very
still
much,
going, isn't he?
Well, that's the
Harvey?
thing. It's like I was saying about Tucky. Brent Harvey was reluctant to stop, and he played local footy and looked fitter than most people playing AFL footy. And it's funny, you mentioned Burgoyne before. I remember listening to a podcast with Darren Burgess, and someone asked him the question, who was the best athlete that you trained, like from a pure power, like performance in the gym, versatility across all different sort of planks of exercise. And he said the two best athletes that he's obviously coached, Arsenal and Liverpool and Juventus, I think he's at now. And he said the two best athletes that he's coached were Fernando Torres at Liverpool and Sean Burgoyne, which in terms of what he could do in the gym, raw power, and also his ability to recover, which is a huge thing for these guys as well, is that, these guys were never the sort of players who'd get a knock and then miss a couple of weeks. They would take their knocks, but they would just be able to keep playing. And Burgoyne was a great example of that.
I'll just jump in at the back end of that. Those guys were all phenomenal. I think Robert Harvey is probably the most physically imposing of all of them, right? One of my memories of all of them, and this is totally not football, but I got to see Robert Harvey outside the Robert Harvey room in St Kilda. He was just like sitting outside his own meeting room. And that's the sort of level you want to get to in life, that you've achieved so much that the meeting room named after you, it's empty, but you choose not to sit in it anyway. I just want that choice in life,
Yeah.
I want to be Lee Matthews and walk past my own statue at the MCG on the way to work.
Yeah. Like, I'll just add a couple of things right at the end. Tucky was the one that I had the first engagement with when I was a little one, and his beard and his aura and his skinniness. Similarly with Tucky, he was described by the Hawthorn fitness staff under Kennedy's reign, and he was notably fitness forward in that era, as having the perfect footballing body. All the chiseled bodies like Dermy and all that, they were too big. Tucky had the perfect body, and he moved from being a skinny full forward to a winger, to a midfielder, then into defence, back into the midfield. He was also quite versatile. And I'll add one more thing. He also had a basketball background. He played a lot of basketball growing up. We don't talk about him having a basketball background, but maybe that's the secret here. Maybe Luke Jackson is the next guy to hit 400.
We've cracked the code. 33% of all VFL AFL 400 gamers have had a basketball background. You've heard it here on the 110% of podcast. We are going to take a break and we are going to cast our minds to the more recent past. We're going to talk about what Stephen King has done at Melbourne, that amazing turnaround start 2026.
You're listening to the 110%ers podcast.
We're back. This is the inaugural, the public debut episode of 110%ers, the footy podcast with Cody Atkinson, Jonathan Horn and me, Matteo Schlapik-Civillo. For our final segment this week, we are going to open the hood a little bit and talk about the, well, fairly remarkable turnaround that Stephen King has managed to spark down at, well, I was going to say down at Casey, but it's mostly been down at the MCG, hasn't it? At the Melbourne Football Club. This is a team that, of course, has and a club that has felt, well, a little bit volatile, a little bit toxic, and perhaps on the field the product's been stagnant for a couple of years, of course, that latter Simon Goodwin era, and it really has just felt like a breath of fresh air this year. The Demons are 7-3. They are 5th on the ladder. They have knocked off Brisbane, Gold Coast, and most recently Hawthorn at the MCG. Cody, how are they doing it?
Look, I think it's a brilliant example of just turning up the tempo. Look, and Jonathan actually had a great piece on it, and I'm going to leave him a lot of room to talk about it. But I think it's risk versus reward. There's always that lever in footy, right? You can go hard, but you might get hurt the other way. And there's been Melbourne had a contest advantage for so long. That's because they've had two of the best contest winners in Petrarca and Oliver, and Viney was also quite good at that. And Max Gawn, who was able to win about 55% of hitouts. If you can do that math, generally you'll win footy games because you'll dominate the territory and you'll just generate enough opportunities. That style fell down for them in finals, and then injuries took its toll, and then whatever happened with Petrarca's terrible injury and Oliver's stuff that we're not going to talk about, that just kind of took the wind out of their sails. Goodwin tried to pivot a couple of times, didn't necessarily work. So I think changing the personnel in the midfield, changing the roles to make them more specific in that transition game, and being a bit more aggressive with their kicking, with their ball use, with the use of the corridor has made all the difference. But Jonathan, I really loved your piece this week. Your quick take. What's your view on all this?
Well, both of you are a lot better than I am at the nuts and bolts of what they're doing. I'll be interested in what Matteo has to say about, because I know you've got a long form piece coming up in terms of actually what are they doing that's different. To me, I always thought this was a really good job to get for Stephen King, and that is that last year they had a horrible start last year, but they weren't actually at this catastrophic stage where they have to sort of just toss everything out and start again. They beat Brisbane at the Gabba. They ran a really, really good Adelaide team close at the Adelaide Oval when Rankin played one of the games of the year that day and basically won the game for Adelaide. They should have beaten a really, really good Collingwood team twice, really. The King's birthday and then a game later in the year. They had those games to win and didn't. And they lost, I think it was half a dozen games they lost by 8 points or less. So they were in a lot of games. And even the game that led to Goodwin's sacking, I think they won by 12 goals or something.
They absolutely pumped West Coast at Marvel, I reckon.
Well, which obviously, it just goes to show, I mean, that's obviously not a great achievement, but it just goes to show that there was something there and that it's a good example and something, Matteo, you've been talking about recently where change is a good thing. And where this team just needed a new voice and it needed a coach who could take players who we were a little bit unsure of, who were kind of teetering, those C-plus type players who could go one way or the other and turn them into legitimately good A-grade players. And I think he's done that. Tom Sparrow is just one example of that. Obviously, it's a pretty small sample size, but just one last thing to finish on is that it's not as if, like, they are beating teams that are really well coached. So they've beaten Ross Lyon's team, they've beaten Hardwick's team, they've beaten Fagan's team, and obviously on the weekend they beat
Hawthorn.
They beat Sam Mitchell. All coaches who sort of delight in taking down these high-scoring, flashy, risk-taking teams, and none of those coaches were able to work the locks of this Melbourne team, which is really interesting. And like the bare basics of it, they're a fantastic team to watch. They've energized their crowd, who are just about given up on them, Melbourne supporters, and it's just Melbourne games at the MCG now are an event, and there are things to watch. And I think they can just keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, they're one of the hottest tickets in town. I mean, I remember attending their game at the MCG last season against GWS. The official attendance that July night was 10,000. I think that was generously overstating the actual attendance. Look, I think it's probably worth saying, and this is not to diminish what King has achieved. He's building on foundations that I think to an extent did exist already. You mentioned the number of close games that Melbourne lost last season, Jonathan. They were by far the least lucky team in footy last year. That they actually lost, or they should have, according to what's called expected wins, so a bit of a sort of nerdy probabilistic formula. They should have won an extra 4 games than they actually won. So I think that actual gap between where they were and where they are this season, partly that is just plain old regression to the mean. Almost by definition, coaches who get sacked tend to be unlucky coaches. There has been a regression, but I think that this idea of taking that ballistic element in Melbourne's game, dialing up that risk a little bit, not being scared to embrace volatility, to embrace damage going the other way, which of course has been the case as well. But when I look at how they're able to spread, particularly when they win the ball in their back half, and Cody, that I think is something that's really facilitated by just becoming a more mobile defence as well. I think moving on from Stephen May and being able to cover the ground better in the defensive half is pretty important here as well. The way that they're able to spread beautifully and just have that kind of concertina, and the influence of players, I mean, especially like Cozzy Pickett, because he's just so quick and so mobile, and his ability to link, and it means that sort of, even if they're forced out of the corridor, which is where Melbourne obviously want to be, even if they're forced wide, their ability to actually sequence their transition chains are really beautiful. And it's part of why they've been able to go from actually having the most offensive one-on-ones last season, which often is a symptom of getting a bit clogged up and moving the ball too slowly, to having the fewest this season. So they're clearing space, they're moving the ball quickly, and it's a difficult problem to solve for opposition coaches.
And it's funny that you mentioned space and width. The way they hold their width, it's interesting to watch them at the MCG. To obviously the press boxes on the MCC side of the ground, and it just feels like at Melbourne games that the ball lives along the boundary line at those games, and and it's something that Mitchell's Hawthorn have done really well as well, is to play wide and to. And it's something actually that Fremantle did really well against Essendon on Sunday, but Melbourne seemed to do that exceptionally well. And someone mentioned this week that obviously the outlier this year is how the hell did they lose to Essendon in gather round, and perhaps like that way of playing. And Matteo, you'd know this better than me, but is the Adelaide Oval narrower than the MCG, or is it a similar width?
That's a Cody question, I think. It's a little bit narrower.
Yeah.
Because it felt like they were cramped in that game, and it feels like at MCG games at the moment, they've just got these acres of space which they exploit and use really well.
So yeah, you've just hit on one of the bigger myth points for me there, Jonathan. It's I did some research a few years ago on ground sizes, and I'm not sure if I think we have this in our mind that we see the SCG on TV and it's a postage stamp, but there's not a ton of gameplay differences until you get to the Cardinia Park, Norwood Oval, super skinny grounds or the super long grounds. But it's hard to reconcile that with what we see on the screen, right? But you look at the statistical profiles of games and just how they're played out, and there's not a ton of difference. Craig McRae, let's get back to Collingwood again because we haven't talked about Collingwood enough, famously marked their training oval with the dimensions of the SCG before their preliminary final one year. And the differences are just so marginal. The goal line difference is 2.5 meters. It's hilarious. But on a broader note, I think King's allowed them to play either skinny or a bit fatter, a bit wider. He's allowed them to play with their intent, and Max Gorn said that it feels like we're playing on our first principles a bit more again, and that enables guys like Pickett to do so much more damage. But underneath that is a really nice rigid system. They've got defensive guys in their midfield. You mentioned Sparrow. Sparrow's works both ways. Steele works both ways. Rather than just all these offensive weapons, they've got a couple of defensive guys that are running there the whole time so that their offense only guys can do damage. Matteo, what stood out for you other than that?
Yeah, I really like that point about the defensive running power of their wingers and guys like, I mean, I'm aware that Harry Sharp has been playing, it's maybe more of a kind of that one of those pseudo half forward roles, but Langdon, and before he was injured, Cully and Sharp, their ability to just cover so much ground, it contributes to the sort of slingshot identity, and something that I'm so often struck by, and I've been lucky enough to see a couple of Melbourne games live, including that win against Gold Coast, was this fact that simultaneously it does look like they're cheating almost in transition, and I use that word in a very specific way to mean players running ahead of the ball so that they always have an outlet option, especially by hand. Their discipline and their spacing with that is really, really intelligent. But also, and I think we were discussing this just a little bit before we started the show today, how they're kind of actually, their forwards push up pretty far up the ground. And so it actually, by vacating that space inside 50, they're actually getting their forwards who aren't really, when you think about Van Rooyen maybe, but Melksham, Myercheck, they're by no means kind of stay-at-home full forwards, really. These are sort of pretty mobile guys, and they're getting involved in kind of post-contest transition-style play. And it's had the cumulative effect of making Melbourne a team that always have an outlet on the attacking side of where the ball is, but they're never sort of really outnumbered at the source. And so that discipline and that ability to almost sort of, overlay improvisation, which is the great strength of a player like Hozzy Picker, over structure, has been really impressive. Of course, the challenge so often, because you do get this sort of, and when people talk about a new coach bounce, I think often what they're talking about without maybe articulating is the sense that clearly a new coach tends to ask different sorts of tactical questions and presents different sorts of problems for opposition coaches to solve. And guys like, Sam Mitchell and Chris Fagan and Damien Hardwick, they're obviously all great coaches, but they hadn't really seen Stephen King footy before. One suspects, given how well Melbourne have jumped out of the blocks this season, that teams will be going to work on them. The Oppo kind of analysis will be focusing on Melbourne quite a bit more over that sort of bye period when a lot of that work happens.
And it's also it'll be interesting to see if they go on to be a really good team, whether we do acknowledge the work that Goodwin did in those last few years to really to shore them up defensively and at the contest. I heard, I wasn't sure who it was this week, but in a similar vein to what Brendan McCartney did at the Bulldogs before Bevo came, he really toughened them up, and Bevo really allowed them to flourish a bit. Obviously, it's a different scenario because Goodwin won a flag with Melbourne, but there is still shades of him in that team, and it's as if King has taken that and run with it, and so far really successfully.
Yeah, I think Jake Lever too. We've got to mention the impact and influence of Jake Lever. I reckon he's been, for the last decade, the most underrated bloke in the league. The way that he organises that defence, the way his ball use, but more importantly, his ability to communicate where the ball's going, where guys need to be. That's just so important for what is now a slightly younger defence and a slightly more attack-focused defence. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Matteo. It's the bye and how teams adjust to them. I don't know if they're real or not, but we're talking about Melbourne in a season that most people had them pegged for bottom 4, bottom 6, and that's remarkable.
It is absolutely remarkable, and I think we'll bring this conversation to a close pretty soon. But I think there's still one more really interesting thing to say. Cody, you said something so interesting, and I think that absolutely represents mainstream opinion, or what almost everyone thought that they would be. Pretty much in the bottom reaches of the ladder, bottom 4, bottom 6. I did an interview for Perth Radio yesterday where the host, quite surprised, said, "Gosh, how are Melbourne doing this? I thought they'd be headed for a rebuild." I think it's interesting to note that I don't think the club actually believe that. I think behind the scenes, Melbourne run a pretty sophisticated operation, and we see that manifest in the fact that they make pretty bold and what at the time often looked like quite unconventional drafting choices. You know, no one really thought that Latrell Pickett this time last season was the first round draftee, and you know, Melbourne sort of gave him a call and invited him, you know, to the first round of draft night. Kozzie Pickett, Luke Jackson, these were speculative type prospects on draft night, and
Jaden Hunt didn't even have a draft profile photo. Like Jaden Hunt was like from an AGS, APS. They were the tennis player. Like they've got a run of those guys.
They do, and they do different things behind the scenes in terms of their analysis, their sort of game model planning, and that they would have obviously seen, because these are sort of reasonably elementary numbers in terms of what clubs look at. This was not a great side last season, but it was also a very unlucky side last season. So there was always going to be the chance of a little bit of a regression. This is still a side with oodles of talent on the list. Any list that has Max Gawn and Kozzie Pickett is going to be capable of playing some pretty decent footy. Guys, I don't know if you have some sort of final thoughts maybe about whether this could be a blueprint. Perhaps Stephen King, the sort of bold, innovative first-time coach for a side like Carlton, or anything left to say before we wrap up.
Just one final thing on Melbourne, and it's sort of related to that, is that, and we often say this of teams, and it's hard to sort of, you know, justify it or whatever, but they're a really well-conditioned team. They're really, really fit, and you can see that in the way that they run out games. You can see that in their physiques. They've got a lot of very similar type, hybrid type players, stocky physiques, but who can also run. And I think that that's a deliberate policy. Also, someone like Jack Steele at St Kilda, and Ross Lyon has not too subtly alluded to this, they thought that his body was shot. They thought that he was almost lame, and that it was, as much as they loved him culturally and whatever, that they were willing to take that risk. And Melbourne, and to a certain extent the same with Brody Myercheck, even though he's had his injury concerns at Melbourne, but still they're clearly doing something really, really good in their conditioning program. To get someone like Steele to be playing the way he is, and also just the way that they cover the turf in all of their wins at the MCG. That's something that really stood out to me.
I reckon that Steele one's really interesting, because there's that physical conditioning element, but I reckon St Kilda also made a bit of a judgment, and they saw the Dacosses, the Nazes, all these explosive attack first midfielders, and thought a more plodding guy, and they didn't have enough speed in their midfield last year, a plodding guy, when we have to fit McRae and a bunch of other guys in there, we just can't fit Steele, and he's got a big salary and we need to shed that. They've just misread the direction of the way the contest works. I think you can never have enough, and we've been talking about Pendlebury, you never have enough guys who are smart, that are intelligent, that know where to go, and Steele is that guy, right?
Well, and Melbourne's constraint was never speed. Yeah, ever since Kozzie had become a full-time midfielder. There was, you know, once upon a time we could have said they had a sort of slow, you know, bruising contest first midfield with Oliver and Viney, but that's not the case anymore, of course. They're so... they're so, here's a word we've used a few times today, you know, ballistic, I suppose, and so quick and so kinetic. So they are perhaps footy's most exciting watch at the moment. Maybe beating Hawthorn at the MCG on Saturday sort of officially meant that the baton was passed over from Hockball to King Ball. Listeners, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. We've run a little bit long, and that's because we have so enjoyed ourselves on this, the public debut episode of 110%ers. Cody and Jonathan and I are really, really committed to making this the best podcast that we can, and something that people can tune into and hopefully learn something from every week. But the only way that's going to happen is if you get involved. So please, whether it's Twitter, I suppose, is a decent place to find us. Jonathan, I'm sure, gets all sorts of enlightening reader emails each week, so you can find him at his Guardian email address probably as well. Please tell us what you think we've done well in this first episode. Tell us what you think we've done less well in this first episode. We're going to take any and all feedback on board, because we're really committed to making this the footy podcast. So I think it's probably time to sign off, and we haven't really rehearsed this, so it might be a little bit rusty, but maybe, look, I don't know, final thoughts, observations, goodbyes.
Been a pleasure, gentlemen. I hope the listeners enjoyed. I'm sure personally, and you know, that I was a little bit rusty, but I hope everyone sort of got something out of that and continue to tune in, because we'll only get better.
Yeah. And because, you know, I read Kane Corns during the week, as you do, and he said that you need to sell takes and you need to provide deliberate opposition. I think this is the best we're ever going to be. I don't think we're going to be any better than this. Take that, Jonathan. Yeah.
You think it's all downhill from here? It's not actually round one or opening round. It's actually, yeah, we've played our grand final today. Well, I suppose the future will render its verdict, won't it? From Cody and Jonathan and I, thank you very, very much for listening, and you'll hear us next week.